Well, good afternoon or good morning. This is Professor Gunter again, and we're doing a course in aesthetics online, as it were, or across a distance. I know that it's a little difficult for you to have to see these on the screen, but it's better that than nothing. So, in the previous lecture, I gave you part of my own aesthetics, which had to do with the notion of tension and contrast, and that I tied all this down to embodied human beings, which then are part of nature. And this puts me outside of a whole lot that's been done in 20th century modernism, and which hangs on in art schools and in music schools and in architecture schools, because I think there's nothing alive to replace it. Having said that, then I talked about the Vietnamese War Memorial, in which I tried to describe it to you as a black wedge, 120 feet long, cut into the earth and getting down to 10 feet below the surface, and containing the names of everyone who died or was lost in that war. In what sense is this art? And in what sense is this, as I believe it is, very good art? Assuming that public art is really different from other kinds of art. It is in some ways, but in other ways, if it's art, it has to be art, and we have to define it, of course, using tension, uh, without which we can't even think about art, said Dr. Gunter. Okay, so we talked about that, and then I ran out of time, and now we're talking about Plato and Plato's attitude towards art. I include Plato in this because in some ways he is anti-art. That is, as I will explain to you at considerable length, while everybody else that we've read so far in this course or talked about, whatever else they believed that art was a good thing or a necessary thing, or in the case of Nietzsche, the only thing that can save us. How do you get saved? Well, first you have to be a German, and then you have to believe in Wagner. I don't know what Nietzsche believed in after Wagner. A kind of freedom beyond good and evil, and in that sense beyond ethics, which he thought was necessary for art, and which he tried to deal with first through the Dionysiac Apollonian contrast, and then through simply the will to power, where I can't follow him. I'm not a monist, I'm a kind of sort of dualist. But at any rate, so now we deal with Plato, and Plato is anti-art. I'll explain to you what it's a very, he really is, but he isn't, and I think he was much torn in personally over this issue. But there are two other figures that I should mention just to fill in the blanks. Two other figures who have written out very famous essays against art. One is Sigmund Freud, who debunks it. Freud said that the artist pretends to be concerned with beauty and form and truth and all these things, but you notice he never says anything about women. This is something when you teach the history of aesthetics or the history of philosophy, you find that women have made but few direct contributions to art. To philosophy. This has been a men's province. I don't know that it has to be, and I suspect if it weren't, we might have a more balanced kind of philosophy going on. In that sense, I'm certainly a feminist, but in an odd way, and I think you should know this, Plato, I've gotten away from Freud, but I'll come back. Plato was a feminist. That is, in an ideal society, women should have the same capacity to compete as anybody else. And I think that is one of the really excellent parts of Plato's Republic, his ideal city, is that you look, a lot of women have abilities, they don't get used. That was his argument is let's get all the ability we can to run the state correctly and things will be better. So give women a chance. And then I have some stories out of my own life that I think support Plato's contention. Feminism is more complex than simply dealing with equal opportunity. So, we talk about Plato and Freud and Leo Tolstoy. Freud thinks that the artist is a charlatan who merely wants money and the love of beautiful women and is not concerned seriously with anything else. This tells us something about artists, because I think this is true. Artists, if they're men, seek the love of beautiful women and seek to be well off. I noticed that so do businessmen, and so do doctors, and so do lawyers, and so do professors, and so do, hell, the guy working out on the street running a yard gang. I'm sorry, Freud, not really. Freud is one of those people whom you can criticize and shouldn't just accept. But on the other hand, he will talk about things that nobody else will, and you need to know those things in order to do psychotherapy. So we're in his debt, but we don't have to believe every word. And his view of the artist is rather strange because what he accuses the artist of is having goals like anybody else. But if that is true, why does the artist go through art to get them? Why is he concerned like the doctor is concerned with health and the lawyer is concerned with the law and so forth? The university president is concerned with the university and his ego. And so the artist, why take that detour that makes this man an artist? And Freud says, I don't know, shut up, he explained, which was Freud's way. It's wonderful to read what you can find about the arguments between Freud and Carl Gustav Jung, who was his student or protege, but who broke with him and went with Bergson. He read Bergson and he gave him what he needed, the ammunition to break with Freud. What did that mean? Well, you find that Freud could be very, very dogmatic and very narrow-minded. But if you would have given anything if you could have gotten into a room and listened to Freud and Jung argue, which they didn't do long because they broke with each other. And that was one of Bergson's great achievements, I suppose, was to create within psychoanalysis a way to do psychoanalysis different from Freud's, though he had read Freud and actually commented on him several times. But a lot about that isn't known, and I don't know how to find it. Now, having said that, then you have Tolstoy, who is really Russia's favorite Christian, and it's a sort of Christian critique of art as loose and immoral and dishonest, and something you take with a grain of salt. So when Plato criticizes art, you must need to know that others have done so. Okay? Others have done so. Now, what is Plato's problem? Well, I'm using this as a way to sneak you through a history of philosophy course without telling you that's what it is. Plato lived like 300 plus BC, or before the current era, and he was a citizen of Athens, which was sort of the cultural capital and the economic capital of Greece. And he was a successor to Socrates and a predecessor of Aristotle. So these are three guys who knew each other and knew each other pretty well. Socrates simply asked questions. When Plato gets him, and if you ever read Plato's Republic, because what we get in our textbook, which starts on page, let me get the right page, please. Page 184 to 196 in the textbook. Socrates would ask questions and would come to certain conclusions, and then the next time you would run into Socrates in the marketplace in Athens or down by the harbor or somewhere in somebody's home, you would have more questions. What do we mean by justice? What do we mean by truth? What do we mean by? And so if Socrates himself seems to have been used asking questions as a method, and that's sometimes called Socratic method, the Socrates that you meet in Plato's dialogues, because every one of Plato's dialogues has Socrates asking questions of someone. The trouble with this is that we know that Socrates might have agreed with many of Plato's conclusions, but you've got a Socrates who's been Platonized. That is, if you ever read a Platonic dialogue and you hear Socrates speaking, you have to understand that he is speaking as somewhat as Plato's mouthpiece. So in this outtake from the Republic, they get to talking about art. Now, why do they do this? Well, there's an interesting word in the English language. It's an import from Greek. It's utopia. And you look at the word, sometimes it helps to take a word apart. An atom is that, or literally for T-O-M means to cut, and A means you can't do it. So an atom is something that can't be divided or cut. That's atom. And so utopia is a very ironic word. Topia comes from topos, or place. U is kind of like A as a Greek prefix. It means not or none. So utopia is nowhere. If I told you about a great idea I had for utopia, you'd say, but Dr. Gunter, you should say in self-defense, utopia means nowhere. Well, not yet, but it's going to be there after I give you. So Plato, when he wrote his Republic, which is easily the longest of his dialogues, it's a book. Other dialogues are on 2 or 3 pages, and others in between the two. But the Republic is a very sizable dialogue, and why? Because Plato tried to put together all of his ideas of what an ideal society would be, and a society which is balanced between the knowing faculty and the military faculty. I mean faculty, I don't mean people teaching something. I mean by faculty, a way of being or a way of thinking. And then finally, the workmen and the craftsmen who do their jobs. And then finally, at the bottom, there's a section that he calls Arcasia, which is very ambiguous treatment. He treats it as, if you're down there at the level of Arcasia, you're either at the level of ignorance or madness. And he's always playing on this. Is ignorance madness? Well, no. And what is the tension between them? That's never been solved. But the point is, when you read the Republic, which you do in our textbook, you're reading part of a discussion of how to create an ideal society, the perfect city. Now, Plato knows that you'll never quite achieve that, but he thinks he's giving you the best possible recipe of a balanced, harmonious, ordered society in which everybody has an equal opportunity and which everybody has an equal, in the sense of being a citizen and having rights, you have an equal place. But then in order to talk about that, I have to stop and really go into the second part of this lecture, and that's describe Platonism to you. What did Plato fundamentally believe? And the answer is he believed in form. Well, we all sort of believe in form. I mean, this lecture may not seem like it, but it has a kind of form, right? By Plato, a form meant, by Plato is a form is meant a universal. Here's a rectangle. Here's a rectangle. Here's a rectangle. Now, when I say rectangle, I'm not just dealing with any one of those, because there are an infinity of other rectangles. I look around this room, I could pick up 100 rectangles in the bookshelves and the books and the pictures on the wall. Incidentally, I would point out to you that the painting over my back is called inductive leaping. I've told you that before, but you may be curious. Induction is arguing from the particular to the universal. And Plato wondered how you could do that. But Plato's way of getting to the universal is seeking for the pure and perfect form of things. Now, I gave you rectangles as an example. It's a very good example for Plato, because Plato throughout his life was in contact with a group of people who studied mathematics. They were a secret society which caused them to be persecuted, and they had almost a religion of mathematics. But in any case, the Pythagoreans believed that the ultimate realities are mathematical. Now, what does that mean? Well, there was the Greek mathematics, which we owe. I can't tell you how much today's mathematicians owe to the Greeks. The Egyptians and the Babylonians did mathematics and geometry, but they didn't organize it in a conceptual way, the way that the Greeks did. So when the Greeks talk about numbers, say if you started with geometry, they said, well, I want rectangularity or circularity or triangularity, but I don't want to just have rules of thumb that I could use in a construction project. That's barbaric. I want to have it's very clear as to what I mean by a plane, a solid, a line, a curve, and then I want to show you exactly what I mean by a rectangle. And I won't take just maybe. Mathematicians don't like just maybe, then and now. They want precision. And if they can get it, they want absolute precision. And so this was then an immense influence on Plato. What is ultimately real? Well, certainly geometrical shapes, and certainly all of geometry could be conceptualized and give us certainty. The greatest example of this, which happened after Plato died some years, and happened in Alexandria in Greece, when Greek culture moved over to Egypt. That would be Euclid's Elements. If you've had any geometry at all, I don't know, I mean, I did study it in Texas as a kid, so maybe they still teach it, or I would hope that they do. But the Euclid's Element gives you a finite small set of axioms, a set of definitions and some corollaries, and from that, all of mathematics and geometry could be deduced. That was his belief. And even if we today would say, no, it wasn't complete, and there are problems with that, the example of Euclid's Elements, if Plato could have read Euclid, he would have been ecstatic, because here is the ideal of perfect deductive order, perfect mathematical order, spelled out in a few assumptions, a few definitions, and everything is clear. And that's an ideal that people still have. If I could, and I won't, and you'll be glad, I will not teach you something called Gödel's proof, or I won't teach you mathematical logic, which I've taught many times. That is, in mathematical logic, they carry this goal even further, and every symbol is analyzed and defined. Extraordinary what mathematicians can do in the way of truth. And this is what Plato's talking about. We don't want just any rectangular thing, we want the perfect idea of the rectangle. And so it would have 4 sides, it would be a plane figure, 4 sides, 4 internal angles, each one equal to exactly 90 degrees, period. And if you understand the definition and you have looked at some rectangles, then you'll say, okay, I'm free now from looking at a particular rectangle, so I'll give you the rectangle again. I don't have to worry about that. All I have to do is think about the pure rectangle, and circle, and triangle, and parabola, and hyperbola, and ellipse, and all of these structures that the Greeks were first to analyze clearly. Everybody used these notions, but particularly in construction. But the Greeks were the first to make a science out of it, in the sense of that which could be known definitely and clearly. Well, you could say that the Greeks in Plato's time had 2 real sciences. We wouldn't agree with exactly the content of those sciences, but they were sciences. And one was mathematics, which was heavily focused on geometry, and the other was astronomy. Now, it's very interesting to me to see the extent that so-called primitive man was an astronomer. Everybody knows Stonehenge, and in Stonehenge you have a temple which is also, or we believe now, an astronomical observatory set up to face the rising and setting of the sun and the moon and the sun on its solstice and all of these things. That is, they use these great stone structures to help them do their mathematics, and we find that the Mayan people in Central America were doing that, and we find all over the world people doing astronomy, but they did it geometrically. What is the shape of the universe? Well, the reigning assumption, there were a couple of Greeks who incidentally disagreed with this, was that the Earth is the center of the universe, kind of flattering, and that then everything revolves around the Earth except the sphere of the fixed stars, which just sits there. And beyond the sphere of the fixed stars is God, or something like God, which we'll have to get to. So Plato then starts out from Pythagorean mathematics as the first level of the forms, and these are universals. And the nice things about universals is that they are perfectly what they are. The idea of the triangle is perfectly that. The idea of a circle, which is all points equidistant from a common point, is exactly what it is. And so in that sense, it is geometry is conceptually perfect. And Plato's point is it just an accident that the sun and the planets and the moon and the stars and the comets circle around the Earth in perfect geometrical patterns? Because they believed that the circle was the way that a planet moved around the Earth, or the sun, or the moon. It was a sort of what mathematicians call a symmetry principle. That is, the simplest and most beautiful way to describe the universe was through geometry. And since they were able to establish all kinds of truths about the planetary and the lunar orbits and the connection of the lunar orbits with the tides and all kinds of things they could learn by thinking in this way. So when Plato talks about knowing, first of all, there's the scientific way of knowing, which is based on geometry, which is not based on empirically on what you see or feel or touch, but it's a realm of perfect forms. Okay, so Dr. Gunter, but where are these? How much do they weigh? How much do they cost? That's the American question. How much do they cost? Well, can I manufacture them? Well, you can manufacture rectangles. The people who did this notebook manufactured a rectangle, but the pure rectangularity is outside of their greasy little hands. It is given in a realm apart from the world, but the world embodies the shapes that we get in geometry. So this duality of astronomy and geometry was dominated by geometry, which Plato believed, and he had every good reason to believe, was where the only place where you could find absolute proof. My father, the engineer, used to talk about mathematics was the only place in which you could find certainty. Everything else had some degree of doubt about it. But in mathematics, 7 plus 5 equals 12. Whether you like it or not, you say, no, it's 13. Well, let's get 7, and then let's get 5, and then let's put them together, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 12. No, you're absolutely wrong. And so Plato had a belief in a kind of absolute truth, starting with the geometrical and mathematical forms, which are embodied, albeit in a somewhat imperfect way, in the universe. And then there is the higher forms, which deal with beauty, which deal with truth itself, which deal with the general idea of order and goodness, all manner of things that you can't treat scientifically, you will treat philosophically, but on the model of the geometrical forms and the arithmetic forms, which are eternal, which never change, and which you can know with certainty. Now, what am I saying here? I'm trying to set you up so that you'll understand what Plato's writing about here in the Republic. An ideal republic would sort of mirror the order of the universe in being hierarchical. You would go from lower to higher to higher to higher. Down there at Icasia, where there's only shadows and darkness and vague figures and a lot of craziness, or all the way up to Noesis, which is spelled Noesis, Noesis. Down there at the bottom is Icasia, which is Eikasia. But the point is, from the lower level, which is non-being, up to the level of the highest possible form, the most perfect form containing the most perfection. There's all these gradations. So Plato's universe is a kind of a skyscraper. It goes up level by level, and as you move up to the highest level, if you do so sanely, you will begin to become a philosopher and wise. But if you remain below, merely dealing with particulars, then you will not be wise. All those different jobs I had, all those years ago, going across Texas on an oil exploration crew, or working on a tugboat down the Intercoastal Canal, or working on a factory in Houston, or the people knew what they knew right in front of their face, but only a few of them seemed to think about the relation of what they knew to something else, and to think in breadth. Well, they didn't know that they were on the way to being philosophers, and they only got so far. But for Plato, the goal of an educational system is not merely to teach you how to get a job, but it's to teach you how to be knowledgeable and wise and how to use your knowledge wisely. So that at the end, the state would be ruled by people that he called philosopher kings. I'm giving you a lot of information you don't need for an aesthetics course. And part of it is a piece of really useless information that when Plato said philosopher kings, he did not mean college professors who taught philosophy. The idea of putting this country in the hands of college professors who teach philosophy is too unpleasant to consider. For Plato, you would have been, before you could have been a philosopher, you had to have served in the military. You probably had worked in the trades somewhere or in business. You would have worked in the legal system. That is, nobody would be a philosopher who hadn't been through the mill and seen the real world like it is and tried having to deal with it in some way. So it isn't philosophy professors who rule Plato's Republic. It's people who have been trained to be knowledgeable, sane, and wise. Why? Then in a pitch, in a situation that's bad, they will do the right thing. And they'll be trained, disciplined, so that they won't fly off at the handle. They'll see problems coming or be more likely to try to set them up the way President Trump didn't set ourselves up and really wasn't concerned about the coronavirus. And I blame him for everything, but especially for having to deliver these lectures online. And if you think I'm going to forgive him for that. Okay, so when you talk about Plato, first of all, you're talking about a multi-story universe leading up to the highest form of all, which he calls the form of forms. Really, you should get that in your notes. Form of forms. And what does he mean by that? He means the highest form, which contains all the others and in a perfect order. He also called that the form of the good, and Aristotle, his student and friend, who nonetheless disagreed with him on some important points, agreed with Plato that there is such a thing as the form of the good or the highest form, but he called it God. Where did the concept of a singular God come from? Well, partly from the Hebrews, of course. They were monotheists, but partly from Plato. Because the form of forms is really like a deity. It sustains everything, it creates what order there is, it creates what goodness can exist. It lasts forever. Everything comes from it, but it has come from nothing. It is self-existent. And Aristotle picks that up and puts it at the head of his hierarchy. And one more little piece of literature or philosophy. In the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas, if any of you are Roman Catholics, you will know this, took Aristotle's philosophy, which had just been discovered, the Arabs had it, and let the Aristotelian manuscripts go into Europe. And so Aquinas' philosophy, which is called Thomism and is still the recommended philosophy of the Roman Catholic Church, was a kind of Aristotle baptized. But it was easy to baptize because the fundamental idea of God that Plato had and God that the medievals had, a lot in common. So it was, I say, easy. It was not impossible, and it lent itself, the Greek metaphysics, to Christian and to Jewish and to Muslim theology. They all used it. When you wanted to get beyond Scripture and start reasoning about God, then you would do something like St. Thomas Aquinas. I just make that point because you should not graduate from a university and know nothing about this. So now we finally come to Plato. He's designing an ideal society, and he's trying to figure out what there is in that society. And the whole society is a kind of educational system. If you take education in the broad sense, that you go through the level of being a physical worker or a craftsman of some kind or a designer, then you end up there with the sciences, in which you do mathematically and geometrically, and then you end up with the fundamental insights into the nature of things, which are philosophy, the love of wisdom. I have suffered long in academic philosophy. I have known many academic philosophers, and I don't know whether or not we should call philosophy the love of wisdom. For some, it's the love of argument. Well, let me not get into that. So when you start reading here in the textbook, what are you reading? How do we shape the ideal society, the perfect city? And the answer is, we will use reason, and we will use reason to provide structure and order. I don't need to tell you that this is an Apollonian universe. That is, the sense of order that Plato gives you as what we should be aiming at is what makes him toss most art, and it's not clear just how much, but a lot, out of the Republic. We're not going to allow various kinds of art in the Republic, at least down at the level where we're educating young people. If there's any message from Plato's philosophy, it is art is bad for young people, which is why young people in Texas are as good as they are, because they don't get much in the way of art. But then I'm sorry, but they don't get much science either, so it's okay. Yes. What do we want in our ideal city? We want an order of the different classes which do different things, and we want the rational people, which is the disciplined, knowledgeable, and experienced people, to be at the top. Otherwise, you just get somebody that the masses think is going to save them, or going to make them rich or famous, or whatever it is that some politicians play on. But this would be bad leadership. You need somebody that has some very sober knowledge. Incidentally, I add to this, because it relates to aesthetics. When Plato makes myths, you've probably all heard of Plato's myth of the cave, where most people are tied down in a cave they can't see to one side or the other, and they see shadows on a wall. That's one of his myths, and a very powerful myth. But another is the myth of the sun, the form of the good, which we could just as well call God. It's not a personal God, but it's God. When we turn around from seeing all these shadows and look at it, we're dazzled. We're blinded at first. And I think that's a nice insight. Everyone who thinks they've had a vision of God have been dazzled by it. Now you say, but they were crazy. Crazy or not, that's how it reached them. And so you have the myth of the sun, which is this resplendent absolute beauty. A beauty which is at the same time goodness. And you get this in Christian theology all the time. I mean, the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the synagogue, same thing. To see God is to be dazzled, to be overwhelmed. Well, what difference does that make? Well, it's a kind of aesthetics. I mean, what is most beautiful? God is most beautiful. Well, how could you talk about this? Well, scripture, or poetry, or music. I assume that every one of you at one time or another have listened to Handel's Messiah. You certainly get it every Easter. And it is, though you may be tired of hearing it, a magnificent piece of music. I don't think I mean, you say, well, Dr. Gunter, how dare you say, well, it has been felt so and has lifted a lot of souls for a long, long time now. So you can have a religious or perhaps a mystical aesthetic. None of the modernists, well, none that I know of, would have accepted that. They, if anything, wanted apparently to get away from it. But then in the end, many of them wanted to get away from beauty. Now, back to Plato. You say, well, why don't you get to Plato? You've been talking about everything else. Tell me about Plato. Well, you're going to put the ideal society together, and you're going to have to educate the young. And not only that, art has an immense influence on people. I think Plato sort of exaggerated this. And does art have an influence on people? Yes. Yes, it does. Is it a good influence? And Plato says, especially on the young, it can be a very bad thing. And so, we're going to have to go through Homer and Hesiod, who are the two sort of religious documents of ancient Greece that everybody referred to as an authority. I know an Italian family in New York who sometimes cite Frank Sinatra as fact. I think that's wonderful, because the Italians make culture and music part of their life, and so we hate them. Yeah. So we're going to we're going to go through these religious documents, and we're going to cut out all the nasty and vicious parts. Well, okay, I wonder if you went through the Bible, what parts you'd have to cut out. And David, it seems, fell in love with Bathsheba, to put it nicely. And she was asked to perform certain acts at pain of death or whatever. I don't remember the exact, but you would have to take the story of David and Bathsheba out of the Bible. The story of Susanna and the elders, well, the elders of Zion raped this young woman. You'd have to take that out. It wouldn't bother me a damn bit. It wouldn't bother me a bit if you took the book of Revelations out. It's a cruel book, and I have Martin Luther who agreed with me on that. Let's get rid of that. Well, we haven't. But there are passages in the Bible that are cruel, or there are passages in the Bible which are sexual and cruel, and we would take those out. It's hard to know what wonderful moral lesson is being taught by the story of Susanna and the elders. We might have to take a few passages out of, I'm trying to think of which book in the Bible deals, but obliquely with sex. Oh, I can't believe I don't know the name of that. That doesn't matter. Point is, we would have to censor the Bible. And so in here is something we would have to censor. And I wonder if you wouldn't agree with Socrates about this, that you're teaching young people how they should act and how they fit in with the society and what kind of society they're supposed to be. And so you tell the story of Gaia and Kronos, G-A-I-A, Gaia, and Kronos, C-H, in the textbook they don't put the H in, I think they should, C-H-R-O-N-O-S. When you read Hesiod, say his Theogony or his Works and Days, but you read Hesiod, and you have the story of Kronos and Rhea. Now, or Gaia, rather. Gaia is the Earth Mother. Kronos is the Sky Father. They mate, and give birth to children, but also implicitly to the universe. Okay? Well, so far so good, but look what happens next. Kronos prevented his wife Gaia from giving birth to his children by locking them up inside her. Gaia didn't like this. Okay, we